became a deputy press secretary to First Lady Barbara Bush in 1989 and helped Mrs. Bush editing and researching for her book, Barbara Bush, a Memoir. She then became or was asked to be chief of staff to President George Bush, and she served in that for almost a quarter of a century, from March 1994 until November 2018. She is a person who is equally home in Maine as in Texas, only changing what she was wearing for the weather and the locale. She helped oversee the opening of the George Bush Presidential Library in 1997, helped edit and research All My Best George Bush, My Life in Letters and Other Writings. She has been involved in a number of boards, including the Fulbright Foreign Scholarship Board. And as a former Fulbright scholar, I thank you for your service on that. Also on the Sea Change Cancer Board, and has been an ad hoc member of the advisory boards of the George Bush Presidential Library and the George Bush School of Government and Public Service, which some of you may have heard of. And hopefully, she is going to plug her new book, which is coming out in June. And with that note of further attraction, I am going to give you the very experienced and very wise Jean Becker. Jean, thank you so much for speaking at our seminar this afternoon.
I am so honored to be here, and I'm so excited to see students, because I talked to Jonathan yesterday, and he said I wouldn't be able to see any of you. So I was prepared to speak into this void of nothingness. So this is exciting to see you guys. I am intimidated because just the name of your class, Science, Technology, and Innovation Policy, oh my God, you all are so much smarter than I am. So that's intimidating, but I'm a lot older than you, a lot older. So that makes up for the fact that I know you're smarter. So I think my job this afternoon is to help you figure out how to take all your knowledge. When you leave the George Bush School, you're going to be on fire with all these ideas and proposals on how to save the world and change the world. And one of your challenges might be is how to convince the rest of the world, A, to believe in you, to believe your idea, to support your idea, maybe even to fund your idea or to hire you. So that's my job. I'm going to try to give you some just practical, good old plain advice on how to get your point across to the people that you need to impress. And I'm going to start in a very odd way. I have written a book. I'm not good. Let me see if I can master screen sharing. Oh, okay. Do you all see that?
We can see the bottom part of it. Oh, sorry, we can see the top part. There we go.
There we go. I'm not a good screen sharer. Okay, I've written the book. I was President Bush's chief of staff for 25 years. And so I wrote a book about those 25 years called The Man I Knew, The Amazing Story of George H.W. Bush's Post-Presidency. It comes out June 1st, and I'm not showing this to you just to sell books. I'm showing it to you because I'm about ready to read something to you from this book. I'm going to leak from my own book. And this will be shocking to a lot of people, but when George H.W. Bush was in long meetings, he secretly played a game, and this game goes back to his presidential days. He told me that he used to play this game in NATO meetings, where all the heads of state would get up and make these long speeches. And President Bush used to play a game that he called BS Bingo. And I'm going to read to you from the book what I put in the book about BS bingo. It specifically is a story. The Bush, President and Mrs. Bush were the founding chairman of an organization called Sea Change. It was an umbrella group about cancer, and it brought together doctors, researchers, pharmaceutical companies, the head of nonprofits. We had a couple of governors, CEOs. It was a wonderful organization, and the Bushes headed up this organization for nearly 25 years. And on the day that he quit, they stepped down as chairman of Sea Change. President Bush told them about BS bingo. So here's what I wrote in the book. It's not very, I'm just going to read this to you. It's not very long. The Bushes dutifully attended all of Sea Change's annual meetings, which wasn't easy. The keynote speakers were typically doctors, researchers, and cancer experts. Frankly, the Bushes and I often had no idea what they were saying. When the Bushes retired as chairpersons in 2010, President Bush admitted as much in his farewell remarks. And yes, it's true, we sometimes weren't sure what the heck the speaker was talking about, he told them. My favorite was the woman who got up and declared I was the father of the genome. I don't even know what a genome is, but I'm very proud to be Genome's father. I did footnote that and said that he was more or less teasing. In 1989, President Bush signed the legislation that funded major genome research, which, as most of you probably know, was a game changer in the science community. Anyway, back to what was in the book. The group was surprised by this confession. After all, President Bush was famous for furiously scribbling notes during all these meetings while Mrs. Bush needlepointed. Many Sea Change members had marveled to me over the years at his note-taking and often hinted they would love to see those notes. I pretended not to hear them. It was a ruse. What he actually was doing was playing a game he called BS bingo, which he took quite seriously. He explained the rules in an email to family and friends in 2003, asking their help in coming up with 25 words to put on a bingo card. And this is what he wrote them. I think I've stumbled across a great way to make money. I'm going to apply for a patent on a new game, bullshit bingo. Am I allowed to say that in class, Jonathan? Too late now. Okay, thank you. Bullshit bingo. On the bingo card, I will place 25 terms that are overused. Terms are words that often crop up in speeches, words that are used to impress. Words are terms that have become cliches. And quite frankly, the listener is tired of these words. A few examples: cut to the chase, symbiotic, 24/7, synergy, interdisciplinary. President Bush hated the word interdisciplinary. Once the 25 words have been selected, I will have them printed on the cards. I will then sell the cards to the Aspen Institute, the Council on Foreign Relations, Davos, the Davos Conference, athletic banquets, roast, and I see the UN General Assembly as a major buyer. The market should be huge for this game. People that go to conferences and listen to long, boring speeches will be encouraged to try to get 5 up, 5 down, or 5 across. When they do, they will stand up in the audience and yell, bullshit. This could help guard against future excesses. That's the end of his email. When President Bush told the Sea Change members about his bingo game, they were at first shocked. So yes, when some of you thought I was furiously taking notes, he told them, I was actually playing bingo. I share that story because it really is a great entree into what I want to talk about today. I'm sure some of the Sea Change speakers were quite devastated to find out that President Bush was not writing down everything they said. Instead, he was playing bingo because he thought their speeches were just a little full of you know what. So what I would like to try to do today is to try to prevent all the future President Bushes in your life from playing bingo while you're talking. That while you're standing there giving your presentation to a room full of people, that someone isn't playing bingo. Or we're really going to talk more than the spoken word about the written word, which is more my forte. How do you get someone to read your letter, to read your proposal, to listen to your idea? How do you get them to tune in? Your job is much tougher than any generation before you, because we have information coming at us from so many directions. And you know that there's social media, there's email, there's texting, there's Facebook, there's all the platforms I never even heard of. And there's still phone calls and the mail and what's on television. There's so much noise out there. How do you manage to get your voice heard? And before I get into the specifics of my advice, I wanted to share with you, but I'm not sure I shared my screen correctly. Like most Americans, I'm completely zoomed out. I am over zoomed. I'm so over Zoom. Not you. I'm so happy to be here. But today is just a typical day. I've had one Zoom. I had a Zoom meeting this morning and that was fine. And now I'm Zooming with you all. Love that. But in addition to that, I had 4 invitations to 4 Zoom webinars. And if I did this correctly, I would love to share with you those invitations. These are sort of hard to see, unfortunately. So one of my examples is a Bush School event tonight, the return of great power rivalry between the United States and China. That's better. This first one, I actually did attend this one at noon today because I'm on the board of the Kinder Institute. But the name of this webinar is Enumeration and Supremacy, Federal Power. What the hell does that mean? Do any of you all have a clue what that means? It's actually a great seminar. It's actually a month-long seminar every Wednesday. What it's about, it's explaining to us the constitutional power of the legislative, executive, and Supreme Court. And really, it's wonderful in context of today's current events. But this title, enumeration, do not ever use the word enumeration in any of your proposals. I'm just telling you now. Grant, can you scroll down? This is the Scowcroft Institute tonight. I cannot attend this. I actually think it probably would be interesting, but my advice to the Scowcroft Institute would be, why should we care about this? Most of us know that one of the most important foreign relations right now and for the foreseeable future is between the United States and China. The United States and China needs to figure out how to get along. But this should be written, this could be better promoted. They need to say that. We need to know about the great power rivalry. Could you scroll down, Grant? This is a town hall meeting from the National Constitution Center that is tonight. President Bush was chairman of the board for the National Constitution Center for about 8 years, I think. And the topic is, does American criminal justice need reform? And then that's it. And then they just talk about the author. I'm sorry, I got 4 invitations today and none of these reached out and grabbed me. None of these spoke to me. They just need to tell me something a little more. Now you can go ahead and scroll down. This one, if you could blow it up, Grant, thank heavens you're there. Now this one, they did a great job. This is actually not for today. The other 4 were all for today. This was a webinar that I attended last month, The Relevance of George Washington. That word relevance is extremely powerful. extremely powerful. It immediately says, okay, this may be important to my life. And it was fascinating. The whole webinar was about, was George Washington an important man in his own time? And the answer is yes. Is George Washington still important today? The answer is a resounding yes. But the relevance of George Washington immediately drew me into this forum. I just wanted to share that with you as just one example of how all of us are getting boom, 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 all day, every day, Zoom invitations. And one of my problems are the problems of all these people who think I should be attending these webinars. And it reminds me of the days that I was President Bush's chief of staff, and I would have 25 letters asking for something, proposing something on my desk. Who has time to read all of that, to attend all of those? So you really have to be sharp on how you get someone's attention. So now I'm just going to go into the practical advice. I was President Bush's chief of staff for 25 years. And I will tell you that there were more days than not that I was absolutely overwhelmed what was on my desk, what was on my computer. President Bush, the whole world at some point wrote him and wanted him to be involved in their project, in their cause, or all of the former presidents. And because President Bush was sort of the dean of the former presidents, they all looked to him for, should we do this? Should we support this? Should we do this event? They looked to him for advice and what he thought. And so it fell on my plate to sort of sort through all these invitations. These were people who wanted President Bush or all the presidents to do public service announcements, to help them raise money, to be honorary chairs. A big thing was to be honorary chair of their cause, of their event. Can you attend our event? And if I have 25 of these on my desk, I would like to think that I judged all of them on their merit, but I would be lying if I said that. The ones that got into my folder that went to President Bush are the ones that I could most easily figure out what they were asking for and what they were saying. So hopefully, I think I saw this up here. I'm going to put up my advice. This is just a memo I wrote myself. I'm going to go ahead and share it with all of you. And I'm going to sort of go back and forth, and this isn't very organized to me. I'm going to sort of go back and forth between the written word and the spoken word, but most of this advice, not all of it, most of it can apply to both. Number one, as we would say in the newspaper business, do not bury the lead. Tell whoever is let's say you've written a letter or you've written a proposal. Tell the reader what this report is about in the first sentence. What is it that you need? What are you asking? And then you can go in detail. In newspaper reporting, we called it who, what, when, and where. When you wrote a breaking news story, we were taught, tell the reader in the first sentence, what happened, where did it happen, when did it happen, who did it? The alternative to do not bury the lead, if you can write a first sentence or even a first paragraph that is interesting, that is thought-provoking, that is intriguing, that also works. That would get them hooked. It would help them want to know more. But if you go that route, as I say in my notes here, then in the second paragraph, tell them what it is you're talking about. You can be cute and mysterious only so long. By the second paragraph, you need to tell them, you need to put meat on the bones. Why are you writing? What do you need? What do you want? Number three, know your audience. I cannot tell you how important that is. Whether it's an auditorium full of people that you're talking to or the one person that you're writing to. You need to figure out, do your homework and find out What about your topic, your proposal, your idea is relevant to your audience? Why should they care about that? And even if you don't think what President Bush maybe cared about your project, you need to talk about that first. And then you can go on and talk about the rest of it. But you need to convince me, therefore President Bush, fairly early in the proposal, okay, we should take a look at this. This is something we're interested in. This is something we're doing. My next piece of advice, unless you're addressing a group of your peers, this is not the time to show how smart you are. Keep your language direct and basic. You should not have to look, no, someone who's reading your proposal should not have to look up the meaning of a word in your proposal. Going back to the Zoom invitations for today, enumeration. What does that mean? I looked it up. Even after I looked up the definition of enumeration, I was sort of underwhelmed by it, quite frankly. One of the best things, one of the best exercises for someone who considers himself a writer, I was a newspaper reporter for 10 years. I spent 4 of those years at USA Today, whereas the Washington Post and the New York Times would take 30 inches to explain the news, some breaking news story. When you wrote for USA Today, you had 15 to 16 inches. That was about the length of a typical news story. And trust me, you become a better writer when you have 15 inches instead of 30 inches. You really learn how to get in and out of your story and tell the reader everything they need to know. So just keep your language basic. Don't show off. We don't need 5-syllable words. That segues right into keep it short. I am the big believer of one-pagers. Tell if this was something that is written, tell them in one page what you need, what you're asking, why President Bush should care, why I should care. And then if necessary, you can always attach a more in-depth report that can have graphs and charts and bullets and all sorts of stuff. But try to do it in a one-pager. Likewise, in a speech, President and Mrs. Bush kept all their commencement speeches to 10 minutes. They never spoke more than 10 minutes. And let me tell you, they used to say more in 10 minutes than I've heard a lot of people say in 30. Now I'm going to give you some really odd advice because I couldn't think of a better example than the Bible. And I really don't like using the Bible as an example. I try to think of something more secular for those of you who are not Christian or atheists and don't read the Bible. But be specific. And if possible, tell a story. So I just wrote a book and I had the best editor in the world. And in the first draft of the book, he constantly wrote in the column, don't tell us, show us. He was constantly pushing me to tell more stories in this book, to think of more examples. It was one thing to say, President Bush was one of the funniest people I ever knew. Okay, so what? You better have some stories to back that up. So the best example I could think of, this is an odd example. I should have thought harder. But if you've never read the New Testament, I encourage you to read the Gospels and to see how Jesus would handle this in his lifetime of his 3 years in public life when he was trying to illustrate a point, particularly to his disciples and apostles, and they'd be standing there with this blank look on their face. He would tell what the gospel calls parables. He would tell a story. He would tell a story to explain what he was trying to teach. And then the disciples would sort of shake their head. He was masterful at using stories to make a point. I highly recommend that you do the same thing. I recently helped Points of Light, whose board I'm on. They're applying for a $20 million grant from the Kellogg Foundation. The program has to be about race relations, about diversity in our country. the application they're going to turn in is excellent. They did a great job, but I pushed them to tell more stories. They did a lot of explaining on how they would use the grant money. And I said, you need to be more specific and tell a story, even a fictional story. This is how you see this money will be used. As you can tell from this memo, I'm big in favor of bullets. I love bullets. I love using bullets. Thank God my editor loved bullets. There's a lot of bullets in my book. Bullets make your important points more easily identifiable. It's my favorite way to organize material. Don't be repetitive. I hate repetitiveness. All of this has just sort of been practical advice on how to present your information, but you need to use that advice to showcase, why is this important? Why should a future boss of yours, why should Bill Gates, why should, let's think big here, Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, a former president of the United States, the Kellogg Foundation, who can give you $20 million to underwrite your idea. Why should they care? You have to showcase, why is this important? So you take all the practical advice I gave you on how to write a better report, but just make sure you use that advice to make the point. This is important because it will solve a problem. It will make life easier. It will change the world. You need to convince people that you have figured this out, and we need you. We need you in our life. We're going to come back to this point later. I want to end on that before I go to questions. These next 4 bullets, I'm embarrassed, are really my pet peeve. But I can tell you that all my fellow chief of staffs in the world of former presidents agreed with me. If you're sending somebody, this is strictly about a proposal, a letter. If you're sending someone something that you need or want them to read and pay attention to, this is really practical advice. Number 1, don't ever send anyone a long email with an actionable item on a Friday afternoon, especially the Friday afternoon before a 3-day weekend. And let me tell you what will happen if you're dumb enough to do that. What happens if I would get a lot of these, like this long email, Jean, I need to talk to you, and this is about, we need to do this and that. Well, I didn't have time on a Friday afternoon nor did I want to listen to this new idea. By the time I would get to it the following Tuesday, there would be 150 emails on top of it. It is going to get buried. So this is more important than my pet peeve. It's about trying to figure out how your email should not get buried. And this is just on phone calls. Don't call people before noon on Monday or after lunchtime on Friday. Just don't do it. They don't want to talk to you. They want to be finishing up their own business and dotting their I's and crossing their T's. Likewise, I hated people who loaded my inbox the day after Labor Day or January 2nd. Those are the 2 biggest back to work days in America. And anyone who sent me a proposal on January 2nd, I immediately thought, this is the dumbest person in America, that they really think I want to start the new year reading their 5-page memo. And my whole point is just to think through the timing of when you hit somebody up that you want their attention. The last one may be the more important one, and this is something we dealt with a lot. Don't make your deadline their deadline. I cannot tell you how many people would send me a big idea or a letter proposal and say, yeah, we need to know by noon tomorrow. Well, that never happened. You know, I mean, if it truly was timely for, I can't even think of a reason, but it was truly timely, sure, we could turn things around pretty quickly. But I was always very irritated at people who made their deadline my deadline. I think I say in here, if you need the answer by the end of the month, then you needed to write this person at the beginning of the month. So that's just really very practical advice. Now that I taught you how to write the letter, now you know when to send the letter. And I'm going to go back to my last bullet point. When you end your letter, or you end your proposal, or you end your speech, as I told you, the first part of it, you need to be very specific on what you're talking about, what you need from your audience or this one person. The last paragraph is your opportunity to really be philosophical or poetic. I think I put in here deep. Yes, even be deep. You need to be thought-provoking. You need to end your presentation with something that your audience, whether they're reading it or listening to you, will go, aha, wow, now I get it. Oh my gosh. It's the kind of ending that you can hear a pin drop in the room. Or if it's someone who's reading it, you're reading this and you're like, oh my goodness. And I call it, you speak to their heart. For the science and technology crowd, it may be more you speak to the brain, but you want to speak to their heart. You want to leave them wanting more or wanting to be a part of what you're trying to sell here. I was trying to think of some good examples, and I'm anxious to get to your questions. So we're not going to read through all these, and let's see if I was able to successfully. This is sort of an odd thing to use. I had to do this anyway. They're actually taping the audio version of my book today. They're in the studio right now taping the audio version. I decided not to read it myself. And the readers have been driving me crazy, calling me to see how to pronounce things. The good news, they're out of the studio now, thank heavens. Otherwise, I probably would have to answer the phone and say, it's Saddam Hussein. Anyway, I was reading the eulogies from President Bush's funeral, and I copied and pasted how everybody ended their eulogy. And there is one ending that I now know by heart. And rather than go through all of these, what I might do is send these to Jonathan and email these to Jonathan and ask him to email these to all of you. And I hate to say this, but I put these in descending order. There were six eulogies at President Bush's funeral, 4 at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., and 2 at St. Martin's in Houston. And they were all excellent. They were all outstanding. But one person's ending, to this day, I'm not sure I'll be able to read it to you. It is just so perfect. So this is the former Prime Minister of Canada. I'm not going to read all these. I'm just going to, Jonathan, can I just send these to you and you can send them to the class?
Send them on.
This is President Bush's grandson, George P. Bush, the Land Commissioner of Texas. Again, an excellent, he says, God bless you, Gampy, until we meet again. Very sweet. Senator Alan Simpson of Wyoming, one of his best friends. His was very, very personal, very touching. The 43rd President of the United States, he totally broke down. Again, this was very personal. So through our tears, let us see the blessings of knowing and loving you, a great and noble man. He totally broke down through here. Secretary Becker, who spoke at St. Martin's, he quotes William Butler Yeats. Meanwhile, President Bush had quoted William Butler Yeats to him, and then Secretary Baker talked about that latter. Beautiful ending. But the winner is John Meacham. John Meacham, and it should be John Meacham. John Meacham's a writer. The rest of these guys are statesmen, relatives. They're not writers. John Meacham is a historian and Pulitzer Prize winning writer. So let's face it, if he hadn't written the best ending, shame on him. But at some point, I want you to read all these endings. I can even send you the whole eulogies if you want. But John, his ending, again, you could have heard a pin drop in the National Cathedral. He's talking about President Bush. He was always extending a hand, always opening that big, vibrant, inclusive, all-enveloping heart. And if we listen closely enough, we can hear that heart beating even now. See, I'm going to cry, beating even now, for it is the heartbeat of a lion who not only led us, but who loved us. That's pure poetry. And again, everybody has a different opinion. And I know, advising you all, you can't put a eulogy type ending on the end of your science and technology paper that you're writing. But really think about, I really think your first paragraph and your last paragraph are the two most important parts of a speech and of a written proposal. In the beginning, you have to grab them and make sure they're going to read to the end. And then at the end, you got to speak to their heart. And if you do that, I personally think Bill Gates is going to, or the Kellogg Foundation is going to give you $20 million to fund your proposal. So now those were all the notes that I made for you guys. I hope they made sense. I would love to hear your questions.
And there's no better way in an academic community to grab somebody's hearts and attention than waving thoughts of, this will help you get $20 million.
And that's why I included the Kellogg Foundation grant application that Points of Light is making. I mean, there's bigger, again, talking about President Bush and people trying to get his attention. Yes, it was huge to get him to join their cause, to be honorary chair, to do a public service announcement. But let's face it, a lot of this is about money and getting the capital that you need to go forward, or to get someone to hire you, or someone to say, yes, we're going to do your project. So tell me what you're thinking. Tell me what questions I can answer.
Okay, we're going to open it up to questions. And again, this is getting back to one of our basic themes we've talked about. There never is enough time or resources to do everything you want to do. And as Jean Becker has very thoughtfully pointed out, with wonderful first and last paragraphs, I should add, the people, you're advising, the people you may be sending these policies, they've got a lot on their plates. And, and for the most part, they're not evil. They want to do the right thing, but there are a lot of people saying, this is the right thing to do, or this is a higher priority, to do X as opposed to Y. And with that note, start waving those electronic hands, and I will call on people.
President Bush was masterful at bringing people to the table. And probably the best example would be Desert Storm, in which it was one of the largest coalitions, maybe the largest ever put together, when in 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait. And countries from Egypt to Jordan to Saudi Arabia to the Soviet Union, which was the big shocker because Iraq was one of their client nations, to, of course, the usual suspects, France, Great Britain. There are 25 countries joined that coalition to kick Iraq out of Kuwait. And the question is, how did he do that? Well, it's sort of a complicated answer. I'm going to go backwards a little bit. President Bush was our UN ambassador under Richard Nixon, and he was famous for inviting the UN ambassadors from tiny little countries to go to lunch or to dinner, or he would drop by their offices, and they were always shocked because they were used to the American UN ambassador would hang out with Great Britain or France or their allies or the big dogs, but President Bush would show up at Tanzania or Peru, and he took him to a lot of ball games. Well, what happened 20 years later when he was president of the United States, a lot of those UN ambassadors, guess what? They were foreign ministers. A couple of them were head of states of their countries. And it's one of the best examples ever of, as you climb the ladder, be careful who you step on to get to the top of the ladder, because you don't ever know who you're going to find when you get there. Well, when President Bush got to the top of his ladder, when he was president, he found a lot of old UN friends who, like him, now had a higher place in the world. So that's number one. He could call people up in all these countries, call them by their first name, and talk about it. China is interesting. It's another going backwards a little bit. When Nixon resigned and President Ford became president, he offered President Bush ambassadorships to London or to Paris. Those are considered the top ambassadorships because it's London and Paris. He said, oh, how about China? Well, we didn't even have formal relations with China yet. We did soon, but he didn't even have the title of ambassador. His title was envoy to China because we hadn't formalized relations. But he was smart enough to know, this would have been 1974, he was smart enough to know then that China would be, sooner rather than not later, a major player on the world stage. So he and Mrs. Bush go to China. They were only there for about 18 months before he was called back to head up the CIA. He loved it in China. And again, a lot of the people who he met while he was in China, Zhang Xiping, I didn't say it right. Zhang Xiping, I think not quite right, was president of China when President Bush was president. Well, he met him while he was the envoy in China. He met all the ambassadors from all the other countries. So he was masterful at bringing people to the table, Joseph. And of course, I'm not objective. I cannot tell you what exactly he would do because I can't put words into his mouth. But I know if anyone had the skill to get the different sides to sit down, after the Iraq War, President Bush hosted the first ever Middle East Peace Conference. He brought to the table Israel and all the Middle Eastern countries, and they actually sat there and talked to each other. So he would be all over this, and he had a very soft place in his heart for China. And I know that he would, because he lived there and he knew the Chinese people, and he knew that they were people just like us. And he would not like all this rhetoric, that it's us versus the Chinese. So I have no idea if I answer your question. So I will add one more thing. His national security advisor, Brent Scowcroft, for whom the Scowcroft Institute is named, used to tell me, and they wrote a book, President Bush and Brent wrote a book about their foreign policy called The World Transformed. And Brent told me that President Bush liked to call heads of state and just check in. And he would tell Brent and his Secretary of State, Jim Baker, one mistake a lot of presidents make is they only call their peers when they need help or when there's a national crisis. Brent said President Bush was the master of just calling and say, yeah, just checking in. What's going on in Mozambique today? And again, he would call countries in Africa, in South America, in Asia. He didn't just call Canada, England, France, he called everybody. And again, when it came time for Desert Storm, these people were all on board. Okay, next. That was a long answer.
And a fascinating one.
President Bush would be dismayed truly about the state of politics in our country right now. And President Bush was not a big fan of partisan politics. And I actually looked at a speech he gave in 1968, wanting it to use it in this class today. And I hate to say this, it was not well written. It was not a good, it was not a good writing sample. But in 1968, President Bush voted for what was called the Open Housing Act. And it was 4 years after the Civil Rights Bill passed, of course. And he was not in Congress at that time. But the Open Housing Act was a continuation of civil rights, in which it meant that people of color, particularly in the South, and I can't remember the term for it, but there was a way that real estate was sold that shut out people of color, and they called it redlining, I think. I can't remember what I think it's James is nodding yes. I think it was either called redlining or yellow lining, but the Open Housing Act basically made that illegal. And that whether you were Black or brown or Asian, no matter what your ethnicity was, you had a right to buy a house in any neighborhood in America. He got crucified here at home, crucified for that vote. And the speech I wanted to share with you was he flew back to Houston and did a town hall. And I mean, he was getting hate mail. His life was being threatened. The letters would use the N-word. It was just horrible. And I hate to say this, I really can't think of any people in Congress now who would fly home and face their constituents the way he did. And by the time he got done talking to them, they gave him a standing ovation. And basically what he said to them was, I voted my conscience, and I voted what was right for America. I did what was right. And he had just come back from Vietnam, and he said, we have young men, there were no women then in the Army, we have young men of all races and ethnicities fighting for this country. And then they come home and we tell them, yeah, but you can't live next door to me. Sorry. It was a great speech given from the heart. But I was watching CNN Saturday morning, and there's a CNN commentator called Michael Smerconish, who has a show on Saturday morning on CNN. I know Michael. I like him a lot. He's a former Republican. He's no longer a Republican. And he was talking about some of the Republicans who voted for impeachment, who voted, to certify the election. And he said, who do these Republicans remind me of? And I was so surprised at 8 o'clock on Saturday morning, I'm still in my pajamas. There's a picture of 1968 George H.W. Bush. And Michael Smerconish said, this is who George Bush was in 1968. And look what happened to him. He was like, come on, folks. So somehow, Christian, we need to get people to understand it's that country comes before party. Country has to come before party. President Bush got beat up on email. You probably don't even know this. He died in 2018. And in 2016, without telling his chief of staff, he leaked out that he was voting for Hillary Clinton and not Donald Trump. And the social media went nuts about this. And it's not that I disagreed with him. I just wish he told me so I was more ready for this. And social media went crazy. But because longtime Republicans were saying, how can you betray your party? And President Bush's answer was, it's always about your country. Your country is always first. And it doesn't seem that everyone doesn't believe that. I will say when that happened, I was for one day, we were in the vortex of social media madness. And then Angelina Jolie announced that she was divorcing Brad Pitt. And that was it. I was very grateful. I was ready to be out of the tornado of President Bush announcing to the world he was going to vote for Hillary Clinton instead of Donald Trump. But I think we need more people, both Democrats and Republicans, who understand that they need to do what's right for their country and not the party line. And I hope we get there. I've just joined the board of a new group that is going to make that their cause. And I don't know if I can help them, but I hope I can.
Out of curiosity, what's the group?
They don't even really have, here's the interesting thing, and you all are too young to know this, and I never watched this TV show. It's either going to be called We the People, or they may call it something else, but it was founded by a Hollywood actor named Andrew Shue, who was on Melrose Place. And I never watched Melrose Place. It's a hard you all never question. even heard of Melrose Place. But on the board is one of President Bush's granddaughters, Lauren Bush, that it did not make sense. And Lauren called me and asked me if I'd be willing to join them. And what they want to do is to bring to the table in life Trumpers, liberal Democrats. He and Mrs. Bush were very involved in cancer. People in the middle, they had lost a daughter just to talk to each other. 3 years old. Robin had died at age 3 of leukemia, and no one does that anymore. When he was president, I don't know if it'll get anywhere. Founded something called Points of Light. Right now it's called We the People, but we'll see what happens. And Points of Light is all about
We will keep
service
everybody on this
and
list
about
informed.
volunteerism and getting involved in your community. And when it opened in 1997, the George Bush School of Government and Public Service was very important to him. Anything to do with leadership, just a big believer in public service. He was so proud of this school. And there's a big section in the book. In fact, there's one chapter that's called What's in a Name? And I talk about everything that has been named from him, from an aircraft carrier to George Bush Airport to CIA headquarters. But I end the book talking about the Bush School, because by far the thing that meant the most to him was the George Bush School of Government and Public Service. The Navy did not take that well. They thought it would be the aircraft carrier, but it really was the Bush School. So the first thing I did, James, was if you wanted him, if you wrote to him that involved those areas of interest, it was more likely you would get your foot in the door. But then there would be the huge exceptions. And I referred to one of them. He was chairman of the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia. He was the first former president to be chairman of that board. And I wish I could remember, they made their pitch to me first. And they reeled me in. And I went to President Bush, and he was doubtful, but he agreed to see them. So the head of the National Constitution Center, they came to Houston. 2 of them came to Houston and made their pitch, and he said yes. It had to be something that he felt wasn't being done. Both of the Bushes, it irritated them. They felt there were too many nonprofit groups. I remember I did some research, and at one point there were 150 nonprofit groups that raised money for breast cancer. Not just cancer, but breast cancer. So one of the things that the Bushes, if it was a new idea, If it was a void that wasn't being filled, that would be one way to sort through this. Been there, done that. This group's already doing this. Now, call, like someone wanted us to get involved with Habitat for Humanity. Okay, have you heard of Jimmy Carter? Exactly. Come on. So a lot of it just had to do with what their interest was. And then of course we got into the disaster business. And this sort of goes back to what Christian was talking about. There is an entire chapter in the book called The Odd Couple about his friendship with Bill Clinton. And I hate to say this, but President Bush loved the disaster business. He didn't like the disasters, but I know why. He and President Clinton, they were all over it. And I mean, even if there was just a hurricane out in the Atlantic, President Bush would say to me, "You better watch that hurricane, Gene, because Bill and I may have to get involved." I'm like, oh my God, it may be a category 1 that just, skirt. And he says, well, we need to watch that hurricane. I know why he liked disaster work. President Bush was, he's one of the most decisive people I knew, number one. And the thing about disaster work is that it was immediate, it was timely, and there were very hands-on things they could do to help people. As opposed to cancer, where I think, I have it in the book, MD Anderson, I think the Bushes raised close to $100 million for cancer research. Well, that's incredible. But President Bush liked things that you could touch and feel. And after Hurricane Katrina, one of his grants that he granted, we gave a ton of money to this town in Mississippi whose sewer system had completely broken down, and they were desperate for sewers. They said, no one will move back to this town unless we have sewers. Oh my God, President Bush loved that project. We gave them the money to build their sewers. Because but it was hard. It was definitely a challenge. For Mrs. Bush, of course, it'd be literacy. She had one cause. Well, cancer. They did cancer together, but she was determined to help. She wanted all Americans to be able to read. So for her, if it wasn't related to literacy, we pretty well said no across the board. She was very, very focused. So.
Okay. As somebody who attended the four presidents fundraiser at Reed Arena, I will say there was nothing as inspiring as seeing Bill Clinton, wheel President Bush across that floor. I mean,
I love that.
It was just so touching.
Do you want to hear the backstory of that event?
Please.
So this is Hurricane Harvey, 2017, right? So Hurricane Harvey happens, and that fall would have been the 20th, and that November would have been the 20th anniversary of the library and the school. And we were the school and the library both opened in 1997. So the foundation, the Library Foundation, was planning an event for that fall, for when we got home from Maine, to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the library and the school. It was going to be a barbecue. We'd arranged for Larry Gatlin to come and sing, and the Gatlin brothers. And we're just going to put a big old tent out on the plaza and just make it a barbecue and country music and just celebrate 20 years of the library and the school. And President Bush, this is just a year before he died, he said, we're still in Maine, and he said, this is not the time to be celebrating something that happened 20 years ago. He said, we need to turn this into a fundraiser for Harvey. Let's keep the barbecue and keep Larry Gatlin. And, but the point is going to be a fundraiser for Hurricane Harvey. So I told the library, and they thought that was a great idea, and we would charge money and all that. So I called the 43rd President's Chief of Staff, Freddie Ford. Honestly, the Bushes were not in good enough health to really carry this off themselves. Again, it's 6 months, it's less than a year before Mrs. Bush died. She died in April of 2018. It's almost exactly a year before President Bush died, and they're definitely in declining health. And they just were not in good enough health to host this event alone. So my first call was to Freddie Ford, who's 43's Chief of Staff, and he said, absolutely, of course, we're there. I don't even have to ask him. He will co-host this event. He already knew that Laura Bush couldn't come, but he said he'll co-host this with his dad. And so I'm like, okay, problem solved. So then as a courtesy, I emailed the chief of staffs of President Obama, President Clinton, and President Carter. And I said, just FYI, on a Saturday night in October, we did it in October, on a Saturday night in October, we're going to do a fundraiser at Texas A&M for Hurricane Harvey victims. And, you know, we have Larry Gatlin's going to come and sing, is going to do a barbecue, and don't expect you to come, your guy to come on a Saturday night. But gee, if you're in the area, we would love to have you. Well, immediately, President Obama's chief of staff called me and said, yeah, he would like to come. But we can't tell from your email. Do you want him to come? He would like to come. And I said, well, yes, we would love for President Obama to come. Absolutely. And so then President Clinton's chief of staff called me, and he was going to be in Europe. And she said, he can't, you know, read your email. He's gone. He can't come. And I said, you know, that's fine. We didn't expect anyone to come. I said, President Obama, I think is coming. She's like, what? I said, yes, he wants to come. She says, I'll call you right back. And she called back and said, if you thought Bill Clinton was going to let Barack Obama come to Texas and hang out with the Bush boys without him, you got another thing coming. President Clinton will be coming home a day early. We're changing his entire Europe schedule. He's coming. I'm like, okay. So then I called President Carter's chief of staff, and he's the same age as President Bush. He was in better health, but he wasn't traveling a lot. And I said, Beth, I think I may have bad news for you. And she said, oh no, what? I said, President Clinton and President Carter are coming. I mean, President Obama. She said, yeah, I don't even have to ask him. He'll come. He's not gonna. So they all came, which was amazing. And then, as you know, Jonathan, since you were there, Lady Gaga called, unfortunately called President Obama's office and she wanted to come. And poor Larry Gatlin was told, yeah, you can sing one song at the end of the show. I know, poor Lady Gaga was a surprise. We didn't tell anyone she was coming because we sold out. We moved it to Rita Arena. There was no barbecue. And the only other story I will tell you about that night is all the former presidents gathered at the Bush's apartment beforehand, and Mrs. Bush gave them dinner. And the program began at 7, and I was under enormous pressure to keep them on time because we had several platforms, and I think CNN was going to go live, at least for the beginning. We had, this show had to begin at 7 o'clock. Well, these 5 former presidents, and Secretary Baker and Dick Cheney were also there. And, you know, they're like a bunch of junior high boys. Cannot repeat this to anyone. But Secretary Baker called me. Yeah, Susan and I would like to come to the big event. Is it true all the presidents are coming? And I said, they are coming. He said, well, I would like to get in on that. And I said, well, I knew President Bush would say yes. And he said, well, of course, Gene, they'll all want to see Jimmy Baker, and we want, you know, he'll know good gossip. We need him. So then Secretary Baker called me. I'm telling you, this is junior high. And he said, yeah, I called Dick Cheney. He wants in too. And I'm like, oh God. But they were so, and I'm not going to tell you what they talked about, You can probably guess what they talked about in 2017. They were just, and I'm the one who had to stand up at 6:30 and say, quit talking. Actually, it was more like 6 o'clock. I told them to quit talking, eat their dinner, because we had to be in the motorcade moving by 6:30. It was one of the hardest things and most fun things I did as chief of staff. I told 5 former presidents, 1 former secretary of state, and 1 former secretary of defense basically to shut up. I put it differently in the book. I can't even remember what the question was. Sorry, I'm rambling. But that was a great night, wasn't it, Jonathan? It was amazing.
That was, and if you want to talk about an evening of unity and good feeling and, you know, country first, and across the generations, across the musical range of talents, and again, you know, for me, seeing Bill Clinton push your boss across the stage,
Yeah,
and you know,
they loved
we
each other.
yeah, you know, we really left that feeling proud, really proud to be Americans, and really proud that in some way we were helping out our fellow Texans.
And when George W. became president, it became really confusing to have 2 President Bushes. So that's when we started doing 41 and 43. And this is, I find this very endearing. Not Jimmy Carter, but oh my God, President Clinton loved being called 42. And then President Obama loved being called 44. They sort of loved this number thing. So that fund, for a long time, we'd raised $41 million. And they accused me of, I don't know what they were accusing me of. They just thought it was odd. It was 41 million. Then it went to 42. In the end, we raised 44 million. And President Obama was so excited that we raised 40 because that was his number. And I'm thinking, oh my God, you all were president of the United States. But we raised a lot of money that night. It was a great night. Okay, next question.
Okay, I'm going to combine two questions that someone sent. The first was, how did your journalistic training prepare you for a career in public service? And what advice do you have for aspiring political servants, possibly to become a journalist?
Again, that's sort of a great question. So I was a newspaper reporter at USA Today. I covered the 1988 campaign, and I was the feature writer for the election team, which means I got to interview all the candidates, which was really fun. There was something like 15 of them that year. And USA Today did a series called The Candidates at Home. And I loved it. I went to all their houses and interviewed them and their spouses. And then USA Today during the fall published a weekly column written by Barbara Bush and written by Kitty Dukakis. It was called I think it was Behind the Scenes on the Campaign Trail. I was their editor. And I wasn't thrilled with the assignment. I didn't really want to do it. And I ended up loving it because I got to know both of those amazing women really well. But I was shocked when the election was over. I might add that I grew up a Democrat. And by that time, I was probably solidly an independent. But I was shocked when Mrs. Bush's chief of staff offered me a job in her press office as a deputy press secretary. And I wasn't sure I wanted to do it. I love being a reporter. I loved it. And I was going to cover the White House. I was going to be one of 3 USA Today reporters to cover the White House. And I thought about it for a long time. I grew up on a farm in Missouri. And I went home for Thanksgiving and I told my dad, who did not graduate from high school, who was one of the smartest people I knew, that I had been offered a job at the White House for the incoming first lady, but I just didn't know what to do, blah, 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 blah. And my dad looked at me and he said, oh, it was also going to be a huge pay cut, which at that point in my life, I was pretty much living paycheck to paycheck. So a pay cut was not going to be easy. But my dad said, seriously, you're telling me that the future First Lady of the United States of America wants you to come and work for her at the White House as a deputy press secretary, and you can't make up your mind? He said, what the hell is wrong with you? So I tell you that story because it's the main piece of advice I give young people. I'm not a big believer in 5-year plans. Or, it's fine to plan and it's fine to think you know what you want to do. But the most important thing you have to do is to stay flexible and to be open to unexpected opportunities that come your way. And I think that was my issue with this job offer. I was exactly where I wanted to be as a journalist. Exactly. I was going to cover the White House. And the thought of going off and doing something else that I knew nothing about scared the heck out of me. And my dad said, you've got to take this leap. And I remember when I told my boss at USA Today at that point was right on the Potomac River. They've since moved, which is too bad. We had these great buildings right on the Potomac River. And the managing editor was just screaming at me. And he said, if you cross that river, you will never, ever come back. This is the biggest mistake you're ever going to make. It was horrible. Well, you know what? I never did cross that river again, nor did I want to. So my biggest piece of advice is to stay loose and to stay open and to new ideas. And you're going to come to some forks in the road that weren't a part of your original map. As far as what skills I took with me, I would say having to think on your feet and having to I spent a lot of time covering hard news before I became the election feature writer. I used to cover disasters, which set me up for later work on President Bush's disaster work. I used to cover tornadoes and hurricanes, and I think covering breaking news was good for me because there was a lot of unexpected things that came my way in the White House. But when President Bush wanted me to be his chief of staff, I went to Houston with them after he lost the election in 1992 to help Mrs. Bush with her memoirs. She wrote them herself, but I was sort of her editor, her researcher, her fact checker. And we were done with the book. And I had a job interview in Chicago with the Chicago Sun-Times. I was going back to reporting, and President Bush called me in his office one day, and I'd gotten to know him a little bit that in the year it took us to do Mrs. Bush's book. His post-White House chief of staff, a woman named Rosa Maria, was getting ready to retire. And President Bush asked me if I would just stay until he hired someone. And I said to him, and be your chief of staff? And he said, yes, I just need an interim, someone to keep the seat warm. He says, I have to figure out what to do here. And I said to him, sir, I have never been anyone's boss. I'd never had staff under me. I'd never done a budget. I'd never been the boss. I said, I don't know how to be chief of staff. And he said, don't worry about that. Just do it for a few months. And then I'll bring someone in and then you can get on with your life. We never talked about it again. And years later, I teased him. I brought up that conversation and he didn't remember it. I said, sir, for 20 years, I've been living in fear that you're going to walk into my office and say, good news, Jean, I have hired a chief of staff. You're done. But we never, we were just off and running. Again, I took a sharp turn. I was going to go back to journalism, but I took a sharp turn, and with absolutely no regrets whatsoever. Just keep an open mind. And what Mrs. Bush would tell you, she was big in her commencement speeches. It's particularly if you're going to be a public servant, which means, which most of you are, and it probably means you're not going to make a lot of money. You might, you will. When you write your tell-all book, you'll make a lot of money. But you're not going to be a celebrity. You're not going to, have your own private jet. Find your passion, like your job, like what you're doing. And heavens knows there are some fascinating job opportunities on the federal, state, and local level. I mean, public service is, you guys, you really rule the world. Don't tell Bill Gates I said that, but you all have more impact than he does in many ways. So find your passion. Do something that you enjoy. Just like President Bush and disaster work. He found his passion.
Uh, and sadly, there was a lot to keep him occupied.
Sadly,
Um,
yes.
okay, I'm gonna first part of our seminar today. We talked with an A&M scientist on climate change, and a big challenge was, how do you get people to talk with each other, to sit down, and President Bush was very skilled at forming, as the Gulf War demonstrated, pragmatic coalitions between politically divided um, um, elected and non-elected officials. Um, how would he bring policymakers, politicians together on climate change, either in the U.S. or internationally today?
That's a tough question. And, uh, he was a man ahead of his time. He was so excited. He put a windmill on Walker's Point in Kennebunkport. And he was hoping to take the Bush's home in Kennebunkport, all wind energy. And it didn't work out, unfortunately. The windmill's still there, but it couldn't power all of Walker's Point. Um, Probably one of the toughest things he did as president, besides Desert Storm, and it's probably one of the reasons why he lost the election in 1992. Um, the 1990 budget deal, Congress was at a complete impasse on passing the budget. And what's interesting is to think about, this was 20 years ago. The concern was is the budget deficit was huge. It was minuscule compared to what it is now. We sort of have, Republicans in particular, have forgotten their budget deficit roots. But the deficit, that Republicans didn't want to add any kind of spending because of the deficit. The Democrats had all these programs they wanted funded. And so the government shut down. We're at an impasse. President Bush sent the two sides to Andrews Air Force Base with teams from the White House. He challenged them to go to a hangar at Andrews Air Force Base in DC and not to leave that hangar until they worked it out. And can you imagine them doing that today? And they agreed to do it. So Democrats from the Senate and the House, Republicans from the Senate and the House, and then a team of people from the White House. And they hammered out a deal. And what happened is President Bush agreed to raise taxes in exchange for the Democrats. The trade-off was President Bush agreed to a tax increase in exchange for budget cuts. Gee, let's see, what is that word? Oh, I think it's compromise. And I know I'm being sort of a snot, but if you were to say the word compromise in the hall of Congress today, they would all have to look it up. They would be like, what? We've never heard that word. But he agreed to raise taxes. And it's that kind of coming together, Jonathan, I think that you need. You need for certainly the energy industry. Just take every president and CEO in Houston, Texas, and the scientists, the climate change people, and put them in a room and make them talk this through. But you need leadership to do that. You need someone that both sides respect and who would agree to sit down in a room together. And I do think we're missing that kind of leadership today. I have great hope that there's new leadership on the horizon.
Mhm. Okay, I'm going to pull a final question, a nice, simple, easy question for you for the students, which is, what was the most challenging part of your job as chief of staff?
It's a great question. I hate to do this to you, but read the book. I talk about that in the book. Probably, and this isn't the answer I give in the book, but I talk about a couple of other issues that arose when he was president. Um, the title of that chapter is The Worst of Times. Probably the hardest thing was being in charge of his funeral. And the reason that was so complicated is because it was so big. It's so overwhelming. And you don't know when it's going to happen. And we worked on his funeral for a number of years, but the pieces kept changing. Things would just naturally change. He would change his mind, or people would die, or, it was just sort of interesting. It was hard to have a plan that you could stick to. And being in charge of that funeral was overwhelming because it was, part of it was in DC, part of it was in Houston, part of it was in College Station, and involved a very large family. And it was on the world stage. I mean, Prince Charles came, Angela Merkel came from Germany. The foreign contingency was huge, and you had to squeeze them all into the cathedral. The family is huge. Everybody wanted to be a eulogist. And again, it was a moving target. I remember I told someone once, just think about being in charge of the Super Bowl, but you don't know when the Super Bowl is. Or, so President Bush died at 9 o'clock on a Friday night. And by Tuesday morning, we were wheels up in Houston on our way to DC for the beginning of the 4 days of wine and state and services. So I would say that was the hardest thing I did. And the only thing that saved me was lots of planning and an unbelievable team. Just had a really great, great team.
Jean, we've come to thank you very, very much for spending time with us, for sharing your experiences, for, I think, inspiring us. And as a historian, it is wonderful to go back and hear that, the lessons of the past are worthy of emulation today. And
They
we look
are.
and and we look forward to buying your book soon.
What I would say to you Bush School students, you picked the right school to come to. And when I got done writing the book, and I knew this anyway, this is the last thing I'm going to say to you. President Bush left us a blueprint on how life is meant to be lived. He lived, I mean, talk about a life well lived, but he lived a very big life. He lived life with joy and with purpose and with humor. He never quit giving back. He never quit trying to make it a better place, but he also knew how to have fun. So you you have a lot to learn from your namesake. He taught us how to live a life well lived. And it was a great honor to work for him. And this was a lot of fun. Thank you for letting me ramble on.
If this is rambling, I want to
This
become
is
a rambler.
rambling. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
Take care.
Bye.